Good afternoon. Actually, maybe technically it's good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Maloney. I'm the Vice Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, and we're delighted to see a full amphitheater once again. Let me immediately call to the stage the Director of Sciences Po, Mathias Vicherat, who will say the first words of welcome. Thank you.
Dear Prime Minister, Madam Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, dear Dean of PSIA, dear Arancha, dear Vice Dean Mark Maloney, dear President of the University of the West Indies, dear students, my dear friends, I'm really delighted to welcome you for the inaugural session of the Paris School of International Affairs. Let me say something, you are very lucky today. It is always wonderful to be in the Émile Boutmy Amphitheater when it is completely filled up with students. We are here today to celebrate the start of the new academic year at PSIA. The inaugural lesson is a long-standing tradition. You have the chance to engage with an important public figure, Madam Prime Minister. It is a great honor to welcome her as a guest speaker. Dear Prime Minister Mottley, I extend to you a very warm welcome to Sciences Po. Let me thank you in advance for what I know will be a rich and inspiring exchange with PSIA class of 2024. As I'm sure you have been told, Madam Prime Minister, nearly 70% of this year's incoming class are international students. 70% of this room. In a way, the world is in that room, and 87 different countries. This is really great. This is part of the DNA of our school. I will ask later Dean Arancha González to introduce our guest of honor more fully in just a moment. It is not so often that we have the chance to welcome a guest from the Caribbean region. For that reason, it is special to have Prime Minister Mottley with us today. I'm delighted to report that earlier today we have signed a MOU to extend or exchange arrangement with the University of the West Indies to its Barbados campus. This is really a great news. And a few days ago, and another news that is not only symbolic, few days ago we have renamed our campus of Poitiers for BA students, Latin America and the Caribbean region, which is very important for us. We want to focus on that region. I won't be long, but I have to say, Prime Minister Mottley, that you have shown fantastic leadership in the fight against climate change on the international stage. Your influence is global. You are a true change maker. And your influence extends well beyond your country, Barbados, and well beyond your region. I was personally so impressed by your fearless vision, your stamina, especially during the COP26 in Glasgow. I can remember a question: when will leaders lead? This is the right question when it comes to the political sphere, but also to the economic area. Your motto in Scotland is our motto at Sciences Po: hard, try harder. We have tried harder because climate change is a critical issue for us at Sciences Po. We are at a tipping point. You know that, my dear friends. There is no future generations. We are already that generations when it comes to climate change. For more than a decade, PSIA has offered its students the chance to study that issues, including climate change and environmental transition. This is the reason why this year at Sciences Po, we are launching a brand new 24-hour course about the environmental transformation to all of our bachelor students. Moreover, we are currently recruiting 12 postdoctoral researchers and 16 senior researchers to help us bring together all the added value of the social sciences to support the environmental transition of our societies. I won't be longer, and I let the floor to your great Dean, Arancha. Thank you, Arancha, for everything you have done to make this event happen. I wish you all, dear students, a rich and inspiring lesson. Thank you.
So, it's my great honor to present to you our guest speaker today, as if she needed introduction, but just in case. Prime Minister of Barbados since 2018. She's on her second term and she won it through a landslide victory. Leader of the Barbados Labour Party since 2008. Youngest member of Barbados Parliament. First woman to occupy the position of Attorney General in Barbados. The list is very long. I'm going to cut it short. She's also a very accomplished economist. But I want to talk to you very briefly about her convictions, because this is what matters for today's conversation. She has been a tireless advocate to two issues that will define a more just future for all: climate change and access to finance the long-term investments that our countries need for all countries, not just for the rich, not just for the poor, but also for those countries that are in the middle, like her own country, Barbados. Prime Minister, we've heard you at the UN General Assembly, we've heard you at the World Trade Organization, we've heard you at the COP climate conference in Glasgow, and I'm always struck by how clear you are in explaining the problem, but also by how constructive you are in offering a solution. Because it's not enough to complain that we've got lots of difficulties. We need ideas to change what we don't like. And this is why, colleagues, the future leaders in this room, I think it's very important to you to hear to the Prime Minister why should you care, but more importantly, what you can do. So, Prime Minister, the floor to you, and after your initial remarks, conversation will ensue. So, students, please get the long list of questions that I'm sure you're going to have. Prime Minister, floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, my dear sister Arancha. Thank you very much to everyone, to the head of this wonderful institution on your 150th anniversary in particular. You know, 38 years ago, I sat where you are. I sat in a school that equally reflected much of the world, because at London School of Economics and Political Science, we had a very diversified audience as well. And I sat there listening to the then Prime Minister of Barbados 38 years ago as he came to address us. I say so because when Arancha called and I had to come to see the OECD on some matters that you might hear about during the course of the evening too, and to meet with members of the French government, I felt that this was an opportunity that I could do all of this in one. And the opportunity to speak to future leaders is what really caused me to be here as well. And why? Because you are the ones in a decade, 15 years, will be the ones deciding many of the issues that we are dealing with today. And therefore, how you approach them is going to be the most important thing. And I've come here, therefore, today to talk about two words, simply: justice and solidarity. And I talk about them because I was in a session, in a retreat, with people from all over the world, and people wondered about whether justice and solidarity were not old style and old school. And I realized that maybe I should change it and talk about fairness and togetherness, because every child knows about fairness. And everybody who is small or weak knows that without coming together, they can win nothing. And that is exactly where we are in today's world. Because the issues may appear, on the one hand, to be the climate crisis. On another hand, it may be the pandemic. On another hand, it's the inflation that's literally causing families not to be able to support their own, and the fear of what will happen as winter approaches here in Europe. And of course, then there's the issue of justice and righteousness, the absence of a development compact for the developing countries of the world, while at the same time having a clear understanding that when emancipation came, slave owners were compensated. And you ask yourself, what are the 5 C's that we're really dealing with? We're dealing with the consequences of colonialism. We're dealing with the climate crisis. We're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're dealing with chronic non-communicable diseases. We're dealing with the consequences of crime because of the ready availability of automatic weapons across the global community. We're dealing with all of these things, and we're not dealing with them well. And we're not dealing with them well because there's an absence of justice and there's an absence of solidarity. There was a time when the global South came together trying to fight for a new international economic order. And they did well in terms of solidarity, and they got some movement, but then again, it dissipated. And we've gone from a world that has tolerated and that has encouraged broadcasting, as I just said in the podcast, to the School of Journalism, to one now that reinforces narrowcasting. That I listen to what I want to listen to, I listen to what inspires me, and I forget about everything else. And in so doing, we create a world where we can't even agree on facts. If we can't agree on facts, then we move towards war. And we move towards war because we have 2 different realities, and we believe passionately in what we believe, but we don't accept that there's common ground of facts. Now, I say these things because technology has done wonders for us, but it has also encouraged that narrowcasting, and it has also encouraged the belief that we can reduce everything to a 60-second soundbite and to 4 column inches, or a 2-minute podcast. And you can't. The complexity of what the world faces today requires far more nuanced discussion and requires us to just be a little patient and to talk with each other as opposed to talking at each other or to each other. And I say so conscious that, regrettably, the global moral strategic leadership that is needed more than ever now, not just by heads of state and heads of government, but by leaders wherever they're found, from the church to civil society, to sports, to arts, to wherever, business, wherever, that global moral strategic leadership is needed more than ever. Because having literally made it as easy for me, I had a niece who lived in Australia, and the only thing I couldn't do was to touch her and hug her. But I could talk to her every day. I live in a country where the people who are my friends, I don't see every day. I speak to them, in fact, the same way that I would speak to my niece who lived all across the world at the time. But I say that to make the point that the level of interdependence and globalization that the world has seen, not that it hasn't had periods of globalization before, because it had, but the level to which it has become, the only thing we can't do now is to say, beam me up, Scotty. And those who are Star Trekkers would understand what I mean. But the bottom line is that having gone this far, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. And therefore, we have an obligation now, not just to look at national sovereignty, but to look at global public goods and to look at global public risk. We all suffered for 2 years because of a pandemic that started in one part of the world. And had the world responded differently, and had the institutional framework been there for leaders to talk with each other, to put things in place to assist in a coordinated manner, we would not have had the kind of cataclysmic economic downturn and that which has put millions of people in graves that we've seen? Had we also a different approach to the climate crisis? Many people thought Al Gore was this quirky man who always wanted to talk about environment, only to realize that he was a man ahead of his time, just as King Charles III is, in terms of his commitment to the environment from as far back as the early 70s. Indeed, if you go and research, I think you'll find that the first concerns about global warming didn't start in this century, didn't start in the last century. They actually started in the 19th century, late 19th century. So how do we end up at this point, at the precipice? That's where we are. And you, as young people, should be asking, why did they leave it to us? Because you have no buffer. And if you thought you did, then the heat wave of this summer should remind you. I live in the tropics, they tell me. I don't know what it is to go into 108 degrees. You make sport all the time, and in my day, Third World, who doesn't know Third World in here, go and listen to them when you leave. One of the best reggae bands out of Jamaica for the last 50 years. And they had a song called 96 Degrees in the Shade, real hot. And we used that as the standard of heat growing up as a young person. So when this summer, I saw 108 degrees, and I'm saying, the chickens have come home to roost. And they have. Because even if we get hot, we have breezes from the ocean. When you get hot here in Europe, you don't have those breezes. And then we have the floods from North America to China, and now, horrifically, to Pakistan. And then you have the droughts and the groundwater crises. Or if you do and come over and fly over the Caribbean Sea at the moment, or the Gulf of Mexico, you have the sargassum seaweed, which smells of rotten eggs. And luckily for us, it's only hit us on our east coast and not on our west coast. We get it maybe 10, 12 days on the west coast, but on the east coast, overnight you can have 4 or 5 feet of sargassum weed on a bad day gathering. How did we get here? How many people who sat in your chairs decades after decades after decades in the last 150 years have refused to accept the responsibility of fighting for justice and for bringing about solidarity? And that's why I've come here this afternoon, to talk about justice and solidarity, about fairness and togetherness. I'm going to pause because I'm comfortable that the questions that will come from you will allow me to speak on almost every topic that I want to speak to. But more importantly, it gives you voice and it allows me to know where your head is at and to see where and truthfully where we are going to be able to go, because you are the leaders of this world and you have the opportunity to help shape this world. But what you can't do is to be sucked in for the ride and to stop thinking and to stop exercising judgment or discretion. Your role at university is not to come out with a body of knowledge. Your role here is to come out with the ability to think and to exercise discretion and never to lose compassion, because without heart, your brain goes nowhere. And don't ever forget that, because there but for the grace of God goes I. Each of us knows specifically someone, some families who otherwise could be here with you, but who through lack of opportunity or through hard knocks are not here. And the world can only survive if we take care of the most vulnerable among us. And that doesn't only mean people, it means species of all types, and it also means countries of all types. And regrettably, the world in which we live in still has the imperial order stamped all over it, from the P5 in the United Nations, the permanent 5 that does not include any of the other countries as of right. And we saw the example of how wrong that is when Russia chaired the Security Council as it invaded Ukraine. When the G7 countries, or G8 as it was, and the G20 can exist but leave out the African Union, but include the European Union, when the African Union is 3.5 times the size of the European Union and has the biggest demographic dividend going into the next few decades. When we can have the international financial institutions led as a result of an agreement reached in 1945, when it was pretty much a North Atlantic world, but now excludes the participation of the majority of the 193 or 94 countries there are in the world today. These are the things that you have come, whether you know it or not, to have to correct. And if you don't get it right, then it means that what I said in 2018 in my first address to the UN General Assembly, regrettably, may end up coming true. That the world, I said then, looked too much like it did 100 years ago. I didn't yet know that the Spanish flu reincarnated was going to come, or that the war in Ukraine would have come, or that we would have had other instances to be able to excite the level of inequity that we saw in the 1920s now find itself again in the 2020s. But the thing is that that was between two great wars. Do we have to go through another great war and another atomic bomb to do the right thing? Or can we learn from history, as we are supposed to do, even though we don't have eyes in the back of our head? Can we learn from history and gird ourselves to act in the interest of justice, act in the interest of solidarity for those who can't act alone, and make this world, in the words of Michael Jackson, simply a better place? I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So this is meant to be a conversation where you get to put the questions. And I know that you may be a little shy, so I'm going to give you the time to queue on the mics at each side of the amphitheater. And in the meantime, I'm going to shoot the first question. So a lot of what you've described has to do with the international order that we have. So do we throw it away? Or do we change it? I mean, how do we, there is lots of talk about this international order not being fair, not providing for enough solidarity or efficiency. What do we do?
I think that we obviously can't throw it away because we don't have the luxury of treating it like an exam. It's real life. And therefore, we have to modify and fix as we go along, face our problems and fix it, as a previous Prime Minister used to say. And what does that mean? I think the first thing that we have to accept is that leaders must talk with each other. The Bible says that you must not be unequally yoked. And when you have a head of government having to speak to a person below them, then that person may not have the ability to make policy in the same way that the head of government does. And therefore, you can't come out of that discussion with any serious solution unless they've been given a remit to make those changes. Because of the way in which the problems and the crises are coming globally, if we can find the time to do set piece speeches, then we can find the time and energy to be able to have regional consultations and ultimately a truer representative of the global community coming together to make decisions in the interests of us all. And I think that that's the first place we need to start. I think secondly, we need to recognize that we have to revisit some of the accepted ways of doing business and some of the accepted rules in which the international community was formed. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad that we formed these institutions 77 years ago, and they've made a huge difference to the world. But they can no longer be fit for purpose unless they change and become more inclusive. You can't leave out 1.4 billion people in Africa and say that you're dealing with the world. You can't leave out that continent that is now going to give the world the greatest number of new people because of the demographic dividend for young people that it will face. And we have to recognize that, as I've said earlier, the World Bank, which is also known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what has it helped in recent times to reconstruct and develop? And if it can't, in today's world, also assist us in resolving the global risk and the global public nuisances, then it is not being true to its purpose in the third decade of the 21st century. We need to fight the climate crisis, which is existential, not just for small island developing states, but as I've shown, for all of us. We need to, and there are a lot of coastal communities in the North Atlantic countries that will be affected as well. We need to also deal with the pandemics. And don't think about COVID. I chair the One Health Global Initiative, which is dealing with the slow motion pandemic. And you may say, what the hell is the slow motion pandemic? Well, that is antimicrobial resistance. How many of you realize that antibiotics are no longer as effective in fighting infections as they used to be? And there's been no new money going in to do research in antibiotics in the last 22 years, largely because there is no great return on antibiotics in a way that there is on medication for cholesterol or heart or diabetes, because you use that for the rest of your life. But if we don't get it right, you're going to live in a world where you're going to go and have a baby, some of you, and you get an infection, and then all of a sudden you find out that the antibiotics can't cure you from the infection. There's superviruses, and that a lot of the food that we're producing is really being produced now in a way that reinforces that resistance and makes us more vulnerable. And that's why these superviruses in hospitals are not being capable of being cured. So going to the dentist, having a baby, anything that puts you at risk of infection. If we don't have an insistence globally that we put money in researching to be able to help us, we're going to find that this is going to be the largest killer of human beings by 2050. It is already taken 1.2 million lives annually, directly, and another 3.5 to 4 million as a result of it in an indirect way. Then we have the inequity. How can you live in a world where people, the richest people in the world, the top richest tech companies, have a market capitalization of over $9 trillion, and school children in the middle of a pandemic can't even pick up a tablet or a phone to be able to access basic schooling in countries across the world? There's something fundamentally immoral and improper about it. And then you have all of these other companies making egregious profits, either from causing the problem or solving the problem. Where should they stand up in today's world? So I think that we don't have to destroy the institutions, but we need to tweak them. The World Bank needs not only to depend on contributions from the developed world, but it needs perhaps to start collecting funding from those companies that help cause the problem, the global public risks. Oil and gas companies with fossil fuels, put 2% assess on your profits and contribute to the World Bank to help other countries. Big Pharma, put 2% there as well, and let us start dealing with public health and the research necessary in order to be able to solve some of these global public health issues. Banks and financial institutions and insurance companies, they're the most invisible. Put 4% there because you've been working and literally taken from people for too long. And I'm talking of profits. I'm not talking about operating revenue. So the Bible tells you to tithe. We're not even asking for 10%. We're saying put 2 or 4%. And then those who have so much philanthropic capital recognize that the world was not made for you to exercise mercy as another human being on another human being. And that really and truly, the ability to pay a little more taxes without having to depend on your mercy and discretion is what the world needs now more than ever.
So, first question. You
Thank
tell
you.
us who you are, and then you put the question.
Hello, Madam Prime Minister. I'm Marcus. I'm in international economic policy, and I was very interested in what you said regarding speaking with each other and not to each other. And I remember like a very interesting article with Greta Thunberg where she said that when someone is not listening, she feels that there is nothing she can do. And I was interested in that respect. You know, I also ask as a national from a geopolitically less powerful country, what do you do to make them listen?
Things that I can talk about and can't talk about. Whatever it takes that is legal and moral. And sometimes you have to shout, And sometimes you have to whisper, and sometimes you have to pull, and sometimes you have to poke, and sometimes you just simply have to speak truth to power. And sometimes you have to do like what I'm doing now. Don't only deal with leaders, but go to ordinary citizens who ultimately will have the capacity to influence. At the end of the day, look at Black Lives Matter. You're wearing a Malcolm X shirt. Look at Black Lives Matter, George Floyd's death. The United States of America has been talking about civil rights since the 1960s. We know that they've been fighting inequity for centuries. But in spite of talking about civil rights in the 1960s, can you believe that people are disenfranchised because they've been convicted? And who is disproportionately disenfranchised? Who is it that has been disproportionately victims of police inappropriate behavior, let me put it at that. And who is it that is disproportionately populating the prisons? It's black and brown people. And the reality is that it's only when it was captured and it went viral and ordinary people said, hey, this can't happen. And it then caused people across the world to rise up in voice, in chorus, and that is what put pressure on many governments to start to even acknowledge that reparations is a legitimate conversation to be had in today's world. And therefore, that is why I say that things will happen and you will get their attention in ways that you plan and in ways that you really don't plan, but that you know how to surf, you ride the wave when it happens and carry home the point.
Thank you very much. The lady over there.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Coralie. I study international governance and diplomacy. And I have a question, maybe that's a bit more your advice as someone who's worked into the policy, into politics and so on. And basically you were explaining that you were asking why we're sitting here and the same people who are sitting here have just continued these same patterns. And my question is, so I come from a development background, and obviously we've learned all about how the World Bank has done this and how all these institutions have continued inequality. And it's a bit to ask, how do we not continue this? Because, for example, people in my degree will learn all about how bad it is, but then we also go and work private, and then we repeat these. So how do we stop this? How do you stop giving into kind of like, how do you go against the current when everyone around you says, no, this is how things are and this is how you should do it?
They're just doing it.
They're just doing it.
Just doing it. It's not easy to stand up and speak truth to power. But always remember, as was said, power concedes nothing. And if you don't stand up, and if you don't remember that principles only mean something when it's inconvenient to stand by them, then you're going to fall and do anything. The reality is, and Arancha referred to me as an economist. I'm actually not an economist, but I've been thrown into the deep pond because I inherited a country when I became Prime Minister that was the third most indebted country in the world per capita income, so that you had to understand. But what we need to do is just remember why we're here, and that's why the theme this evening for me is not about new international economic order, this, that. It's about justice and solidarity. It's about fairness and togetherness. And if you apply the basic rules that you would apply in your personal life, more often than not, those are the same values that are required for you to take on big causes. And that's why I said just do it. I wasn't being flippant.
No, thank you, that's great.
So if she's not if you are not an economist, then I know of nobody that speaks so clearly about economics than you are. There is a very interesting article that I recommend to all of you. It's in the New York Times, and it explains the big battle that the Prime Minister has been fighting over getting the proper financing that a country that is so exposed to multiple crises, including climate, with some success. We are not yet there, but with some success. Close parenthesis to the gentleman.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. My name is Maxime, and I study international security. You talked a lot about justice and climate change, so it raised a question. Vanuatu announced a few years ago his intention to go to the International Court of Justice to ask for an advisory opinion about climate change. And I believe your country is supporting this initiative, among a few others. And I wanted to ask what you think we can expect from international judiciary institutions in the fight against climate change, and in this specific context, what we could expect from this advisory opinion.
Yeah, the truth is that our country is not one of the ones that's gone yet for an advisory opinion, although we are discussing some things with one or two other countries at the moment. But this is uncharted territory. And I keep telling people that if this was private law, there would be no issue because it would be viewed as a tortious interference and that the persons who caused it would be liable. The reality is that the G20 countries are responsible for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and most of it has come as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And what matters is not just the flow of what's happening today, but it's actually the stock of gases, greenhouse gases, that's been emitted since the 18th century that has caused the problem. Now, that's what makes us even feel even angrier, because most small island developing states were also the victims of slavery and colonialism. And therefore, our energy, our blood, our sweat, our tears helped to finance the Industrial Revolution. And now the consequences of the Industrial Revolution are also threatening our very existence. I say all of that to make the point that the morality of the issue is clear. But justice is a funny word, because justice seen through the eyes of judges is not justice seen through the eyes of ordinary people always. And therefore, the court can go either way. The court can break ground as a form of judicial activism and public policy, which is what I would like to think it would do. And that's one of the reasons why I did law at LSE, because it had an activist interpretation to the law, as opposed to a slavish interpretation to the Constitution that the Republicans, although quite frankly, they have also had a level of judicial activism, but cloaked in slavish interpretation with respect to Roe versus Wade and other things that they're trying to reverse. But the international judiciary can go either path. And it really just depends on the quality of argument and the center, the moral center of those sitting as judges. Because if the moral center of those sitting in the United States Supreme Court did not speak out in Brown versus the Board of Education, there would not be the level of development of civil justice and rights in the United States of America that we see. And if you look at almost every major change in terms of law and precedent, it is because judges have stepped out of the temple of their familiar and exercised, in most instances, a form of judicial activism. The cases that indicated that a slave was less than a person and property is exactly what kept people suppressed and oppressed for centuries. So, short answer, it can go either way, but I would like to believe that in the same way that I've seen the mores change over time, and I have faith in your generation. I have faith in mine too, but mine was just touching the water in the sea. But I think yours can carry it the full way, because you have the capacity to know different and to think better. And the world is on track for a major, major crash from which we cannot recover. And I made the point all the time that to think that you cannot have failed civilizations and failed states is a nonsense. When we were growing up, people lived in Montserrat in large numbers. When the volcano came, 2/3 of Montserrat had to evacuate. There are countries across the world that have failed. There are civilizations that have failed that you know and you've studied. And there's species. I've never seen a dinosaur yet. You seen one? Understand? So we see species fail. Why does this generation of leaders believe that they can continue on the same path, doing the same thing, and expecting different results. Einstein told us it was the definition of madness. So I hope that those younger people who come to judicial office will recognize that the polluter pays principle can't only just be an international policy concept, but ought actually to be an anchor for judicial activism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady over there.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. It was an honour to hear you speak. My name is Eva Ullinger. I'm the Master of International Governance and Diplomacy. I'm originally from Australia, and in the few days following the death of Queen Elizabeth, there's been a revival of talk about a Republic of Australia, and I know this is also true of many other countries that are still living under the British monarchy. I was wondering whether you could speak on the decision of Barbados to become a republic, and also, like, within my country, I know there's still a huge amount of apathy towards the monarchy. There's not a lot of avid support or avid hatred, but just apathy. And I was wondering whether you could provide any advice for this.
Well, to begin with, I strongly believe that it's a decision for each country to take. And I'm not going to preach to one country or another. In respect to Barbados, this was a matter that, in my view, and in many of us in the government, we felt that it had been on the road for too long. We had been talking about completing the process of independence. We became an independent nation in the traditional sense in 1966, November 30th. And we took responsibility for effectively governing ourselves, but we kept the Queen as head of state. And we also kept the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as our final court of appeal. When I was Attorney General, we literally I chaired the preparatory committee for the establishment of the Caribbean Court of Justice, and we used that opportunity to have that court, which was created with both an original jurisdiction and an appellate jurisdiction. Original as a treaty interpretation body of the CARICOM single market and single economy, just like you have the European Court here. And then original jurisdiction as a final court of appeal, so that instead of coming thousands of miles to London, which most people could not afford to do, by the way, and the cost just prohibitive, we said, no, change it, and let us go to the Caribbean Court of Justice. That was in 2005. April 2005, the court was finally inaugurated. But we never changed the head of state. Now, people say, but the country functioning, why does it matter? It matters because that little boy and that little girl must know that they can grow up and aspire to be the head of state in their own country. If I were to tell you that in France here, the president of France should be the president of Brazil, you would ask me if I'm mad. If you can't accept that the president of France should come from the president of Brazil or the president of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, why then should my head of state come from someone who is not of the country and who we're going to have an excellent relationship, but Arancha and I are great, but we're not family, but we're good friends. And people can operate at a different level without necessarily having to feel subservient. So it was important at all levels. And let me also say why. I lead a parliament, regrettably, that passed the 1661 slave code. Barbados was that place in the 17th century that was at the center of the British Empire in terms of earnings. Just 166 square miles, but it so mastered the sugar industry, and it so mastered the precepts of racism. Professor Landis's vice chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, is the foremost expert that we have in CARICOM on the issue of reparations and is helping us on this issue. And Barbados leads the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations too. But how did we get here? And we ask ourselves this question with respect to many of these issues. That slave code came to be adopted in full in a few states in the United States of America in the 17th century. And it spawned other codes in other states. Now, I feel as though we have a duty to pay forward and to do right. And to that extent, we felt that while we've been able to remove the legal vestiges of slavery and colonialism, a lot of the mental issues continue to bedevil us. We still talk about Black Friday. We still talk about anything black being evil, anything white being angelic. And this is the unconscious bias that we've learned about as new lingo coming out of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters. And as King Charles III said, I referred to it earlier today, when he addressed the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda, in Kigali, in June, he said that this was a conversation whose time had come in terms of how we deal with slavery, how we deal with reparations. Let's take Haiti. Haiti is perhaps the worst example of it. And Haiti, more than any other country, has paid the price for daring to want to be free. And we have to have these conversations if we are going to literally right-size the international order, if we're going to give chances to small states, and if we're going to stop the bullying that takes place in terms of the might of nations determining the future of all nations, small, middle-sized, or otherwise.
Thank you. There is, I'm going to go to the balcony because I know there is also a lot of impatient people out there.
Can you hear me? Oh, no. Oh, okay. My name is Frank. I'm in the Master of Environmental Policy. And I know as an island nation in the Caribbean, you have to weigh the issue of whether a policy is going to be economically efficient or economically just. And I just want to know, how do you get to the equilibrium of making sure that happens? Thank you.
I think it differs, thank you, and it's a good question. It differs really on each one. You can't settle on any issue without remembering context and perspective. And regrettably, there are too many decisions being made in this world today without appreciating the context of them. And why do I say so? Arancha heard me earlier when I did the interview with the podcast speak about the fact that there are emerging market countries and developing countries in the world that have access to clean energy sources. Now, I am a strong proponent of action to stop the world from warming. But I also know that with the best will in the world, how many of you ever heard of a program called Bewitched? Where they had a woman called Elizabeth and she used to twiggle her nose to make things happen. With the best will in the world, we can't twiggle our nose and stop the climate crisis. And we can't twiggle our nose and all of a sudden give countries what they need to get to net zero. This year in March, I announced a tax-free holiday for electric vehicles. Guess what? Can't get them. Can't get the supply. We also announced that every homeowner-occupied house, owner-occupied residence shall have the right to have photovoltaic panels. And the Light and Power Company, the major electricity company, says, guess what? Can't get enough batteries because there's a shortage of lithium. Now, if the world can't get its act together to supply what it needs, then we're going to have issues, not true? And part of the difficulty also is that there are other countries, and the International Energy Agency recognizes that in 2050, 20% of the energy mix of the world will still include fossil fuels, but we hope clean energy, more likely natural gas. Now, should those countries that have access to that gas be the only ones to be allowed to explore and exploit it, especially in the absence of the deal for adaptation and loss and damages not being made to allow our countries on the front line, small island developing states, and basically all states between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn to be ahead? Should they be deprived of financing their way to adapt to a new reality? Because you've got to build coastal defenses. You've got to protect water aquifers. You've got to, from saltwater incursion. There's so many things we have to do to adapt. And let me put it even simpler for you. Anybody who's lived in England knows that the one thing the English haven't managed is to be able to deal with heating and air conditioner properly. And they now have found out that after this heat wave, what do they have to do to a whole host of housing in order to adapt to the new reality of a climate crisis? Well, imagine how much worse it's going to be for small developing countries or large developing countries in Africa who continue to be threatened, and Asia, by crisis after crisis. So we have to look at context and perspective and recognize that there may well be a case for that 20% in 2050 being proportionately divided by all and not just given to those who actually have been the ones drilling for oil or gas in 2020 as opposed to 2050. And that is the fair thing to do. But on the face of it, you may say, well, how the hell are you getting to use natural gas if you're talking about a climate crisis? Well, what are you going to do? Allow people to die from freezing? We don't live in a one-issue world. We live in a world that is affecting us with so many problems. And therefore, we have still to balance development and to balance the issues. So some things may be good on one hand, and regrettably, on the other hand, there may be other things depending on context and perspective.
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me. I'm Tan Yuhang from International Development. So my question is that some critics say that in the past, Barbados was Little England, and now with the fact that last year you seem to detach yourself from the UK, and now Barbados is becoming Little China because all the Chinese investments and other activities. So what was your reaction to that? And secondly, how does your government deal with the relationship with China in the context of these confrontational ideological differences between the West and China? Thank you.
Mercifully, when we became an independent country, and thank you for the question, we have a simple premise that the then father of independence laid out for us. And mercifully, every government, irrespective of political party, has followed it since. Friends of all, satellites of none. The second point is this, that I have not yet found a formula of new maths that says 4% can dominate anything. Our exposure to Chinese investment and loans is 4% of our overall debt. There is no way that 4% of our overall debt can be viewed as China dominating the UK. You know, part of the unconscious bias that we talk about is in that narrative. And as soon as we made the determination, every opportunity was found to attack us. Look and see how whenever they go to certain things, you're going to hear all kinds of narratives start to come out. But they don't relate or they're not buttressed by the facts. Barbados had 2% of its debt exposed to China up until 6 weeks ago. And 6 weeks ago, we took another loan of $115 million US to do the rehabilitation of roads in the Scotland district, which are eroding and slipping, because that part of the island is clay, and that brings our exposure to 4%. So it is a nonsense to suggest that we are pawns of China, and we've answered that over and over and will continue to. Our exposure is far less than Chinese. Chinese hold far more debt in the UK and the US and other parts of the developed world than it does in our part of the world.
To the gentleman over there.
Good evening, Prime Minister, and thank you so much for coming here tonight. You spoke of the multiplicity of challenges that we have to face, that our world is going to have to face. Yet when you spoke about solutions, I saw you picked up your phone and you said, it's going viral, this is viral, it is happening seemingly online for many of those solutions. So the question I have for you is, do you think that the state and interstate structures still have answers to those challenges and can actually provide proper answers to the challenges that we're facing?
I think that it's going to be difficult to move away from the nation state as an organizing entity. But I think the nation state has to be smart enough to know when it needs to open up rather than to be restrictive. part of the difficulty in taxation globally has been how to handle digital transactions because of how and where they occur. But it has not been impossible. And in fact, I spent the day at the OECD earlier this morning, and pillar one of their initiatives is, in fact, to deal with digital transactions, which has been a problem. So I think that you'll find that the nation state as an organizing principle will stay, but what will have to happen is the manner in which government executes itself. We'll see some changes in the way that it has changed over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries. So it's a continuum, and I like to call it a relay race.
I'm going to go up to the balcony.
Thank you for being here with us this evening. My name's Sarah. I'm studying a Master in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. So my question is, how can we transition away from the most harmful industries to the climate, such as gas and animal agriculture, while protecting the rights of workers when, like you said, we're really running out of time for a slow transition?
It's going to be complex. And why? Because long before we started to fight the climate crisis, we had not yet gotten across all countries the right deals for workers. And that's why the work of the International Labour Organization remains so critical. Look, I lead a Labour Party, and I'm proud to lead a Labour Party, because at the end of the day, why have we come to public life? To make a better life for our people. And our people constitute predominantly a large percentage of whom are workers. The problem is that technology is really changing the nature of work. And the question is going to be not only how technology changes it, but who owns the aspect of technology, the robots, the technology, the software, that is going to dominate. And the world has to find, there's some deep, deep discussions that we have to have, because the future of work may well mean that people will not have the opportunities for the same types of work, particularly the repetitive tasks, and the way in which artificial intelligence is just shifting the ground on which everything is happening. Now, what does that leave us to do? Human beings, you know, we were told as children, the devil finds work for idle hands. And if we don't find stuff to keep people busy, that's when we're going to start to find out that too far east is west. And that is when the future of the world, in my view, is going to be at greatest risk. So there's some deep, deep discussions that we need to have. But regrettably, as I said, we're not talking with each other. And as it relates to climate, the interest of workers remains ever present. But we have to do it not just because of climate, but because of the inequity and the other things that were already affecting it before the climate crisis became topical.
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Good evening, Prime Minister. My name's Josh. I'm from Glasgow, and my question's on Glasgow. In the run-up to COP26, there was a shared excitement among Glaswegians about the conference, but the politicians arrived and they lacked ambition. And you made a point in your speech where you said that faces in the room were missing. So I wanted to ask, would you categorize COP26 as a success or a failure? And if it's a failure, who's responsible?
Well, it's not an exam, so it's not a success or failure. It's just a process along the line. I think that we succeeded in bringing more awareness to the topic, but so did Greta beforehand too. So we're not the only ones who brought attention to the topic. I think we have succeeded in making the arguments for climate finance more real, and to that extent, we have to continue the battle on that, and the more people that understand the argument, the more likely we are to succeed with it, especially with the events that are happening, as I said, as recent as this summer. So, regrettably, things don't happen overnight. And, you know, I call myself a Jimmy Cliff girl. I don't know if any of you know Jimmy Cliff. You hear me talk about music all the time, because I love music. Jimmy Cliff had a song, "You can get it if you really want, but you must try and try and try. You'll succeed at last." And the truth is that this battle for the climate justice that we are fighting will take time. The abolitionists did not get slavery moved overnight. In fact, the argument, if you go from the Haitian Revolution to the last set of people, it's virtually, what, a century or more? So we'll continue fighting. Glasgow was an important moment, however, just as the Paris Agreement and what took place here in Paris was important in moving on from Copenhagen or Kyoto. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady over there.
Good evening, Prime Minister. Thank you so much for your wise words. You mentioned, oh, my name is Apolline. I'm in first year of bachelor's. You mentioned that social media had a tendency to trivialize deeply rooted conflict into 2-minute videos and infographics. But then there is another side to social media which could enhance political participation within the youth or amplify the voices of minorities. But do you think that this side of the internet could compensate for the polarization that was created, and if yes, to what extent?
You know, the very things that bring you joy are the very things that are responsible for your undoing. And it's no different with social media and technology. And I think it's for us to come to terms with it. Fake news is a major problem. And if we reinforce realities that people believe to be the truth, then we're unlikely to bridge gaps and create tolerance for diversity. We need to have an appropriate governance framework that allows society and human beings to function while not being exposed to the wild, wild, wild west. And right now, the unregulated nature of social media, as much as it may seem anathema to some, means that those who have power will dominate and those who don't will suffer, like every other metaphor that we can find for it globally. And that's going to be the battle of your generation. You guys are going to have to work out how to keep a moral center for technology that is literally going to be cataclysmic if not appropriately regulated.
But sorry to bounce back, but with our generation, how do we make it so that it doesn't impede with free speech?
How do you what?
Like, how do we make regulation on social media so that it doesn't impede with free speech?
Remember, go back to your human rights and go back to every constitution. Free speech is not all speech.
Yeah.
Free speech exists so long as we don't harm others. That's why you have libel, that's why you have defamation, both civil and criminal. And every right that is given to citizens in a constitution is constrained by responsibilities. And that's why when we passed the transition to a republic last year, just before we did it, we passed the Charter of Barbados as in our parliament to reflect who we are and what we want to be. And one of the notions that we put in there is the notion of active citizenship. How do I go beyond duty to myself, to my family, and to my job? Because look at this building. If they don't maintain this building, what do you think it's going to look like in 5 years' time? It's going to fall. A state is no different. And there's another song by Ernie Smith, which talks about, are we building a nation or are we building a hut? We're building a nation. And it's going to require the same careful tendering that we do for a physical structure or that we do for our bodies. If we don't maintain our bodies, what's going to happen to it? So it's no different. And that's why I say that the discussions are not nuanced enough. So people hear free speech, and they mean free speech is all speech. It's not. If that were so, we would have what in today's world? Anarchy. And that's why I say that the organizing principle of the nation state and the rule of law are likely to endure because we have to find a way to live with each other. But we have to change how we do it. In the same way that I don't expect the new wars to be in battalions and armadas, and it's not going to be. War changes, the clothes of war changes, the spectacle of war changes. And it's going to happen with this. But it's new, and we haven't quite figured out how to manage what we have to do in a way that's fair to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. As a Spaniard, to hear about armadas always gives me a bit of shiva, Prime Minister. I'll go up to the balcony again.
Hello. I have a very short question, and then my mate has a regular question, so maybe we can shoot them both at the same time. But I'm Anna. I'm from Spain, and like many of us here, I am extremely privileged in a way or another to be receiving this kind of education. And as I hear you talk about what you've been going through and what you've been doing, I just can't help but wonder what we can do to support these ideas of solidarity and justice, and how can we best support vulnerable countries. Yeah, that's my question.
Hi, I'm Annalisa, and in the Master Environmental Policy, and following the note of my classmate's question, I think all my colleagues here, we are all very aware of the emergency of these challenges that we've been talking about. But when we try to communicate this urgency, especially to, for example, our parents' generation, we find real physical resistance in a way, because we are often deemed as hysterical or downsized as, students who have no real experience of how the world actually works, and thus it becomes very difficult for us to communicate what we are learning and how worried we are. So how can we address this communication barrier?
Take comfort that it has happened to every generation before, and it will happen to every generation after. When I was a student, look, the big battle was apartheid. Apartheid started back in the 1940s, and there's a wonderful documentary, it's pretty old now, but it's called A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony. And if you get a chance, watch it. And it showed basically how the revolution in South Africa, the music mirrored the mood of the revolution. And in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, it was very much down. And, can you imagine people like Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba leaving their country and can't go back for 20-something years because they're in exile, and all of the other leaders and people. And you know when it changed? When the South African government tried to introduce Afrikaans into the schools, who was it that resisted? It was the young people, not even university students. It was secondary school students primarily. And many of them, yes, lost their lives. And I remember as a young student at LSE, seeing stories on the BBC and ITV in the evening news of all of these young people being literally run down by the South African police at the time. And it was another decade again before Nelson Mandela was released from prison after work by the Eminent Persons Group and all of these other people. But initially, the governments in the developed world did not and would not accept that sanctions was valid, did not and would not carry the battle to the South African government. And it was young people that literally spawned the movement, first in South Africa, and then it hit colleges and universities globally. And that's when the numbers started to frighten people. And that's why when people told me that justice and solidarity is old school, they were really saying that justice and solidarity really belongs to the fight for independence and the fight against apartheid. But it is as valid today as it was in those previous decades. And I trust and pray that, therefore, that you will see it in terms of issues like, you ask how you can help. But let's start first with determining that per capita income to access concessional funding cannot be the only basis for countries when middle-income countries are vulnerable overnight to lose 200% of GDP in one storm, as happened in Dominica. When Bahamas can literally have Grand Bahama and Abaco decimated by Hurricane Dorian that sat over those islands for 2 days straight. But guess what? Bahamas and Barbados I got my first hurricane in 66 years last year after a freak storm 2 weeks before that had 46,000 lightning strikes in 90 minutes. It was like a continuous strobe light, like if you're in a disco. But yet, Barbados and the Bahamas can't borrow from the World Bank today without the fiat of the developed world countries on that board. They gave us permission to borrow for COVID last year. And we wrote back and said, thank you for the permission for COVID and climate. And we're now fighting the climate. And I make this point to show you that taking per capita income as a measurement for access to concessional income, my PS laughs when I use this example, is like taking my blood pressure from 2 years ago to determine whether I'm going to get a stroke today or not. It's completely irrelevant. And what they want now, I suspect, is to tell us that, okay, we will reverse your graduation. Degraduate, never heard the phrase before. But that's not the issue either, because that then is your way of solving the problem that you don't want to change the metric to recognize that vulnerability is real. And how do we get around it? We've come up with a definition that we think can work. That you are a climate vulnerable country, regardless of who you are, if you are at risk of losing 5% of your GDP within a 2-year period, either from a single climatic event or from a series of slow onset events, whether that is France or whether that is Samoa, whether that is the United Kingdom or it is St. Kitts and Nevis, whether that is Canada or is Dominica, or Kenya or Angola. And it is a fair judgment. It allows you to be strategic. The Caribbean Development Bank perhaps would like us to add the length of time of recovery from a climatic event, because small states obviously take longer to recover because there's a disproportionate consequence. Anybody in here knows which country is hit every year by a hurricane? Anybody? Exactly. The United States of America. But yet, we think of hurricanes in terms of small island developing states. Why? Because when a hurricane hits and decimates towns in a state or even a whole state, it does not have a disproportionate capacity on the United States of America's capacity to recover. But when it hits Bahamas or Barbados or Dominica or Antigua or wherever, there's a disproportionate consequence. And therefore, the things that we need you to fight for are to help us with a new definition for climate vulnerability. Then there's the special drawing rights. Why do you have access to special drawing rights sitting down there when you can simply change the rules, the power of the pen, and allow that money to be flowing into multilateral development banks to be able to unlock liquidity at the very time that the world needs it? Then there's the issue of development finance. We can't develop our countries on 7-year money. If most of you went to get a mortgage and only had 7 years to repay for the house, you wouldn't be able to make it. You need 20, 25 years to be able to repay. Many of you need that to repay student debt. How do you believe that a country can bring about development in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure, in all of these things by borrowing 5-year or 7-year or even 10-year money? And that has nothing at all to do with the money we must borrow for climate adaptation and mitigation. So there are a number of issues, and there's the issue of reparations, justice, Haiti. Haiti needs a long-term development plan. I ain't even bothering about the rest of us yet, but let's start with Haiti, because our blood, sweat, and tears is what built the Industrial Revolution. How do you now leave a country to flounder without giving it a trust, a debt for education swap, a debt for health swap? This country, France, did take customs duties from Haiti for over a century. On what basis? If the people declare independence, where are you taking the money for? You know, and it's the same issues with the return of the Benin bronzes. We can go on and on. We need to have a conversation. And there's a wonderful book by Earl Lovelace that won the Commonwealth Book Prize years ago called Salt. and it is fundamentally about the issue of reparations. Any of you in a relationship and the other party offends you, what are you going to require? Some kind of apology, some kind of justice, some kind of contrition. Why do we believe it's different for civilizations and nation states than it is from individuals?
Thank you very much. I hope that you took note of all these solutions that have been put on the table. The lady over there.
Hello, I'm Sofia. I'm from Brazil. My question is about a little bit of everything you've been talking about. I really admire your country's work in international organizations such as the OAS, and I appreciate that you've talked about funding these organizations in multilateral organs, which is really an important issue nowadays to their work. But I also noticed that our countries are not in the same page. Even inside them, we have inequalities, we have major infrastructure problems, and we do not have a consensus on how to fight these common problems. So are the international forums the place where we are going to solve our main issues? And if so, how do we find a path to bring our countries together and make them go forward?
It's actually a combination, because the international forum won't solve the problems. They will allow for the discussion and the movement on issues to give us policy space, fiscal space, room, judicial room, etc. But at the end of the day, sovereignty lies in who? The people. And you've got to come back to the people if you want sustainable change. And you know, in the Caribbean, anybody ever seen how Caribbean people dance in a carnival? We take 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and 4 steps forward and 2 steps back. And President Obama used to say that history doesn't go in a straight line, and he's absolutely correct. Because what we're often dealing with is a conflict of values, and therefore it takes time to be able to move. I would like to believe that women's rights don't have to be fought for in the same way that they did in the late 19th and early 20th century. But I am living proof and know otherwise that misogyny still exists in this world. And it's going to take time, centuries. I'd like to believe that with the legal death of colonialism, that racism doesn't exist, but it does. And it's going to take time to change. So I think that we have to recognize that public education and sensitization of our people. Arancha and I were talking earlier about the need for journalists to be schooled in economics and to be able to educate the public on the basics. In Barbados, we're looking to do that now. We're looking also to deal, we started programs to deal with financial literacy, because the average citizen just does not necessarily know how best to manage their money and what opportunities there are. We have to have a complete review of how we educate people and not believe that education stops when they leave school or university, but that it is an ongoing process, particularly in today's world where everything is changing at such a rapid rate. The conversation and the sensitization and the education has to be consistent if the democracy is going to work. The active citizenship has to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good, I know you have elections coming up soon, so I thought that's why you were asking these questions.
Lady over there.
Thank you very much for your words that were a call for action. Yep. You mentioned inclusivity, the fight for inclusivity in international organizations needing to be updated. My name is Lola. I'm studying human rights and journalism, and coming from Central America, where we are already fighting our own governments and institutions rotten by corruption and violence. How would you approach the need for movement in these 2 different scales?
Which country are you from?
Guatemala.
Guatemala. The truth is that, look, different countries throughout history have had to fight battles. I believe in the United Nations Charter and the principle of non-interference. But I also believe, as I just said, that we need to educate people and we need to speak truth to power and people need to mobilize and organize. And that is fundamentally how change comes about. But it takes courage and it takes sensitization and education. And I think that your ability to do that at the grassroots level is what is going to make the difference. When revolutions happen, they invariably happen not because only the bourgeois try to make it happen, but because they have a mass base, either through passive or active capacity that says live and live on. And that comes because people's sense of awareness is heightened. You can only fight corruption and human rights abuses by literally coming together in solidarity. And that's part of the reason why I've come here today to talk about justice and solidarity. Thank you, and good luck.
Gracias.
Good luck. I say, what's your T-shirt say? Girl is revolt. Girl in revolt. Your T-shirt. Girl in revolt. That's what I thought. I can't be more apt in saying it.
All right, lady over there.
Hello, thank you for being here, first of all. My name is Kayla Renner. I study international security and U.S. foreign policy, and I'm from Washington, D.C., trying my best. I guess I actually recently wrote an article on this topic, but one of the biggest issues that's kind of preventing the United States from kind of making this huge transition to any type of more renewable sources is just because millions upon millions of families and communities, states depend on coal, oil, these major industries that are funded just by these huge, kind of what we've already talked about, these huge companies. And so it's really difficult in order to, what are we going to transition them to? We already had this high-tech debate. A lot of families cannot afford to send their kids to do an engineering degree or a computer science. So it's hard to say, are we just going to destroy rural communities, or how can we actually establish some type of transition in order to make this effective?
Look, transformation is never easy, and green energy is good business and good jobs. But to tell a man who has worked in coal all his life that he's not going to accept it firsthand. And we know what we're talking about. Today I went to the OECD talking about the global minimum tax. When we became independent countries, the countries from whom we became independent told us to diversify away from agriculture, sugar, and bananas, and get into tourism, and get into financial services. And you get into it and you do well, and all of a sudden now you're told. In fact, let me go back, because after independence, you tell us stick with the sugar but diversify. And then Lomé comes, and all of a sudden the whole capacity for the production of sugar in colonies literally goes off the edge of a cliff, because the whole monetary framework to support it goes. And the same thing happens to bananas. Then we do financial services. And then you say, well, no, you need to stop because all of these companies have left our jurisdiction and are now in tax havens and low tax jurisdictions. Well, let me tell you a little secret. Barbados is not a tax haven. Barbados' tax effort is the same as most European countries, 29 and 30 cents in the dollar. But how we choose to tax has been different. We choose to have taxes on land, we choose to have taxes on transactions through value-added tax and through import duties and excise taxes. We choose to have rates on garbage and sewage, and we choose to have a low corporation tax and a low income tax because we feel that disposable income needs to be returned and invested back into the society, because governments don't trade or grow, households and companies do. But we've now been told that that has to change by 2024. Now, how does a small developing country change in such a way where 10% of its overall revenue is affected with less than 2 years to go? And where is the compensatory package if that is what you want us to do? Now, I give you this example because I'm showing you that throughout history and throughout today's world, transformation is having to take place all of the time. But what is needed is time, context, and perspective in order to work out what is a rational period of time. President Biden has done well in getting the climate bill passed, but at the end of the day, it's going to take time before he can train and educate and create opportunities in those states that depend on coal or those states that depend on shale or oil, that there is another way and another future for them. And that's heavy lifting. But nobody ever told us that governing was going to be easy. It is heavy lifting. Thank you.
Lady over there, maybe what we're going to do is, because we're slowly coming to the end, we're going to group a few questions, if you don't mind, so that all of you get to put your questions forward. Please.
Good evening, Prime Minister. My name is Barbara, and I come from Peru. And at the micro level there, we face a huge problem of poverty to the point where Western normative ways of transition in ecological transition are not accessible for people in poverty. And this becomes a narrative in the government that the fight against poverty is a priority over the environment. And the environment is not even high on the list of priorities. So I wanted to ask, what are the ways these developing countries with big capitalistic economies can articulate both fights for them to go and develop at the same time?
Thank you. Let me just, if you are concise, we will listen to all the questions and then give a last chance to the Prime Minister.
Okay, thank you. Evening, Prime Minister. It's okay. Thank you very much for your interesting and inspiring message. I'm Catalina from Chile, also a vulnerable country. We are neighbors. And I'm a Master of Advanced Global Studies student. My question is, we have 100 and more than 100 and more than 300 companies that are they have taken the pledge for carbon neutrality / net zero neutrality, okay? But at the moment in which this pledge have to take into actions, we actually see a lot of profit before the policy will to act. And then we see, of course, making the different path to achieve the common goals very difficult to achieve. So my question is, your sincere opinion, is there any way to actually get from pledge to action in a short term? Because we are running out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shortly, so that she can get to answer.
I'll do this too, because I haven't slept, so brain might not remember more. Very quickly, with respect to poverty and environment, it's Hobson's choice. The very people who are likely to suffer most in a flood or an earthquake are poor people, because their houses are not strong enough and they don't have the income to insure, and therefore we need to be able to address both together. I want to leave you with this fact, because the more people that know it, the more people are likely to begin to understand that you cannot develop countries with 5- and 10-year money. When Britain fought World War I, it went and it raised bonds in 1914 and 1917. And then they realized a little while after that it was difficult to repay those bonds while having to borrow to rebuild Britain. And in 1932, it literally consolidated those bonds into a perpetual bond. Does anybody in here know when those bonds were eventually repaid? In the year 2014, 100 years after the first bond was issued. But yet we're being told that countries across the world should seek to repay COVID debt in 5 years and 7 years and 10 years and have a debt service suspension initiative that's supposed to help 80 countries with only $12 billion and only 49 drew down on it anyhow. Bottom line is that we need a different deal for development, and we need to see development as the ultimate objective. That's why I'm one of the champions for the Sustainable Development Goals, and all it is about allowing people to sleep easier, to become more stable, and to get prosperity. and fairness and justice. And that is what we have to do in fighting the environmental issues. It is ultimately about creating opportunities for civilization and individuals. With respect to, what was the question again, in terms of businesses pledged to action. Bottom line is that there is a definite retardation of the process with the disruption of the global supply chain. I mean, I spoke earlier about some of the things that we need. We want to get to net zero as fast as possible. We have committed that by 2030 we should be 70% of the way there, and that we would like to believe that as close as possible after 2035 we can be there. But we can't get there if we can't get the supplies that we need to be able to transition. And the global production is a major problem. And my fear is that we are talking here at one level, but we are not planning here at the other level. And therefore, it is the worst example of governance that we can find. And that's why I go back to what I said at the beginning. If we were talking with each other, then we would realize the mismatch between aspiration and reality.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The lady over there, then we'll, again, we are now out of time, so it has to be short and sharp.
I will try. Good evening, Prime Minister. I'm Paulina. I'm studying environmental policy. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think are the key challenges for COP27? And specifically, how do you think the issue of loss and damage should be addressed, since the recent negotiations in Bonn show that countries cannot agree on that?
Yeah, very, very quickly. COP27 is likely to bring some progress on early warning systems. But where we need it to bring progress is on more funding for adaptation, because it takes time to adapt. We can't just go and spend money if we get it and get it done in a year. If you're doing a coastal project, you've got to do studies, you've got to look for the moon, you've got to look for the tides. Invariably, you have one chance at that per year. Then you've got to look to financing, you've got to look to procure, you've got to look to execute. So it's going to take 5-7 years to do any serious adaptation work. And therefore, we have literally run out of time if we expect that in 11-12 years, the world's climate is going to get worse. But as we saw this year, it's already there. Loss and damage, I gave you the solution earlier, but the world does not, the developed countries don't want it because they're frightened for liability, just as they're frightened to have the discussion on reparations. And because I think instead of doing what is morally correct, we have middle-level officials, lawyers too, telling them that you're exposing yourself to liability, which will open you up to all other kinds of things. We need to have leadership on these issues. I regret, I don't think it will happen in Egypt, but I don't think we can give up the battle either, because more and more people like yourselves are recognizing that there is merit in those who are responsible for it, helping to pay for the resolution of the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lady over there.
Good evening, and thank you so much for your words. That was...
I'm not hearing you.
Still on?
Yeah.
Is it still on?
Yeah.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your words. It was very encouraging to hear that. My name is Ricarda, and I'm studying international governance and diplomacy. And I was wondering, since you talked about net zero and sustainable development, what are concrete steps that Barbados is going to take in the next years for encouraging maybe other countries, but also being a role model for sustainable net zero development?
Well, the first thing we've done is that we said, look, we want by 2030 to be able to have our electricity sector and our transport sector not dependent on traditional fossil fuels. We will use natural gas as a clean energy bridge simply because we can't do it without it. As I said earlier, we can't get the supply of electric cars. We've also taken a fundamental decision that the wind, the sun, and the water does not belong to any individual. It is part of the patrimony of the country, and to that extent, every owner-occupied house should be able to benefit from it before we start looking at lumpy investments, either locally or from overseas. So we've also taken decisions on plastics, although during the pandemic we had to relax it for obvious reasons, but we've gone back there again. And we are trying to work with the University of the West Indies and others to be able to ensure that not just the advocacy, but the solutions that are necessary, including in building back coral reefs. We are a coral island, and we've suffered badly from it. We're looking to see how we can work with those people who have innovative ideas. There's a young man out of St. Lucia that has taken the sargassum seaweed and using it in a plant tonic. We're looking to see how we can partner with him to be able to help us get rid of the seaweed, which truly, as I said, is noxious and toxic in all of its respects. So in little and large ways, both at the level of macro policy, but also at the level of individuals, we're trying to carry us to live, or to put it a different way, to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. But we have supply problems globally, and that really is a huge constraint.
Okay, the last two questions, we'll take them together. And please, the gentleman over there.
Okay, hi, thank you so much for being here. My question is, in developing countries, we're full of needs. I come from Colombia. And the oil and gas production, its profits finance our social, education, and health systems. How can we go into energy transition if we get profits that help reducing the branch and the inequalities in our countries?
That's what the emerging markets and developing countries are saying in Africa, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, that you cannot rule us out of what has to happen. You know, the reality is that if you say you're not financing new exploration at all, too far east is west. What you've done effectively is to rule out countries like Guyana and Ghana and Barbados and all of the other emerging market countries that can use natural gas to help them finance their way to net zero. So Colombia is a perfect example. Without that income, you're unlikely to bring people out of deep poverty. But by the same token, in acknowledging that natural gas is the bridge, we have to recognize that we can't use coal, and we really need to stop using heavy oil, and that we need to make the profits from natural gas work to create the green environment that we need, and that you're going to need scale at some point, green and blue, I should say, because our maritime jurisdiction is 424 times our land. But there's a point at which where you need scale in order to reduce the price of new technology. And until we get that level of scale, you're not going to be able to go over the line in terms of transforming energy production globally.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and last but not least.
Good evening, Madam Prime Minister. Thank you for being here. My name is Celine, and I also study international governance and diplomacy. You said in your remarks earlier that if we can't agree on the facts, we're going to war. And I know that the issue of misinformation has been briefly discussed in a previous question, but I nevertheless wanted to ask you if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on your experiences with misinformation, especially as a political leader, and what advice you could give our generation when it comes to addressing misinformation, especially in the fight against climate change.
The first thing you have to do is to validate your sources of information, especially in today's world, where there's just so much information out there that you just don't know if it's correct or not. And it looks correct because it has all of the right appearances and the symbols look everything. And I don't envy many young people because it is going to require that from as early as primary school, we start to inculcate in people, do not just accept facts as facts without verification. Now, it sounds bad because a society needs to trust, just like a family needs to trust, an individual needs to trust. And therefore, we've got, as states, as governments, as the international community, in my view, to make it easier for that validation and verification process to take place than it is today. Because if not, people will say, well, I'm watching Fox TV, I'm watching CNN. One is very left-wing, one is very right-wing. Don't know which is which. There needs to be a standard, and the world needs to settle on what that standard can be, where young people can go and validate information without being taken advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mia, we know that you like music. I was thinking of this song by, singers a bit more to our time. Bradley Cooper, Lady Gaga. Are you happy in this modern world? The song is Shallow. I think we can agree two things. One, this was anything but a shallow conversation. And number two, no, you're not happy with this world, but you want to change it, and you have given us a few thoughts on how to do it. Thank you very, very much, Mia, and I think she deserves a big applause.
Thank you. There's only one thing left for me to do, is not just to thank